Good afternoon, and welcome to today's IAC webinar, Compounded Sclerosants, What I Need to Know for a Responsible Decision. My name is Kelly Baer, and I am the Creative Design Manager with Marketing Communications at IAC. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to review a few technical matters and let you know how you can participate in today's session. We would like today's webinar to be interactive, so we encourage you to submit questions. To do so, use the Questions tab located on the left side of your screen. Please submit your questions anytime during the webinar, as we will be monitoring questions throughout the presentation and will try to answer as many of them as possible during the Q&A period. Also on the left side of your screen is the Resources tab. Click on this tab for a link to today's handout, a PDF copy of these PowerPoint slides. Select the file name to download the handout. Lastly, in the lower left of the player, please note the Request Support button. If you experience any technical problems during this webinar, click this button. A technical expert will be there to assist you with any issues you may have. For those who like to take notes during the presentation, look to the right of the slides and click the Notes tab. There you will see a white text box where you can take notes on today's webinar. These notes will be emailed to you automatically at the end of the session. To be eligible for the SVU CME credit, you must be registered, logged into this webinar, then complete the survey. The survey will open automatically at the conclusion of the live session and be available from the IAC Webinars portal for 3 business days. If you are viewing this webinar in a group, please be sure you are also individually registered and logged in on this webinar on another computer or device so that we have record of your attendance today. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted at a later time for on-demand viewing. And now I would like to introduce today's guest presenter, Dr. Nick Morrison. Dr. Morrison is the co-founder and medical director of Morrison Training Institute and the Morrison Vein Institute. Having maintained a private general surgical practice for 23 years, Dr. Morrison and his wife, Terry, established the Morrison Vein Institute in 1995. He is president of the International Union of Phlebology, past president of the American College of Phlebology, and a member of the American College of Phlebology Foundation. And with that said, I will now turn this webinar over to today's speaker, Dr. Nick Morrison. Doctor?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're in the West, which is where I am. So that's my disclosure slide, and that is a beautiful image of the Grand Canyon, which for those of you who may be geographically challenged, that's in Arizona. It's not in Utah, Colorado, or Nevada. People get it confused. So I want to talk first about sclerosants. The most important qualities that we really need from a sclerosant is that they are safe, they're effective, there is a lack of untoward effects in the pursuit of durable and repeatable results. There are 2 FDA-approved sclerosants, at least the 2 most common. There are a number of sclerosants that are FDA-approved, but the 2 most common are a Sclera, which is POLIDOCANOL, and sotradecol, which is sodium tetradecyl sulfate. I should tell you that the IAC, if you are an accredited vein center, the IAC prohibits the use of non-FDA-approved sclerosants. So, what about sclerosants produced by a compounding pharmacy? First of all, what is compounding? This is the FDA statute, and every one of these words are really important. The combining, mixing, or altering of ingredients to create a customized medication for an individual patient in response to a licensed practitioner's prescription. There are absolutely legitimate circumstances in which a compounding drug can be used. For example, if the right dosage strength is not readily available, or if the drugs for certain conditions just aren't available from a manufacturer, and sometimes a patient just can't use the standard version because of an allergy to one of its ingredients, and commercially available drugs need to be changed. So, for example, for children, if you need a liquid form instead of a pill form, or for the elderly. Good medical practice requires that the physician use a legally available drug according to their best knowledge and judgment. And it's the responsibility of the physician or the practitioner to be well-informed and base his use on the firm scientific rationale and evidence. Physician inherently bears some liability risk when they prescribe compounded drugs. So what about sclerosants produced by a compounding pharmacy? Well, there have been papers that have questioned the purity and accuracy of a compounded drug. This is the first one from 2004. Mitch Goldman presented this, and he reported impurities and inaccurate concentrations in compounded sclerosants. So why should you or the FDA care? Well, in 2002, the FDA sampled 29 products, not sclerosants, but just different products that had been compounded. What they found was 9 of the 29 products were not potent enough, and 1 was contaminated. So fully 1/3 of those products were not what they purported to be. And by comparison, manufacturers should fall within 1 to 2% of the drugs that they produce. This is a paper by Jose Almeida in 2007, so about a decade ago. He looked at various forms of STS, sodium tetradecyl sulfate, sotradecol, and then from 3 compounded pharmacies. And he looked at the pH, the concentrations, and the presence of contaminants like carbitol. As you can see, the sotradecol fell within the range very closely to what it was supposed to be. But if you look at the rest of them, the pH was fairly close. But the concentrations ranged from 2.5% up to 3.5% almost, when it was all supposed to be 3%. And every one of the compounded sclerosants contained contaminants. Now, this is another paper that Bob Weiss wrote in 2011. I will point out that the study was funded by Mertz, who at the time provided STS. They looked at 6 samples of 1% POLIDOCANOL from 4 different compounding pharmacies and found that the range of concentration was from 1 to 3%. So if you think you're using 1% POLIDOCANOL for a moderate-sized vein and it's actually 3%, the incidence of complications is obviously going to go up. And the analysis of all 6 of those samples did show impurities. So their conclusions were that the POLIDOCANOL did not deliver the claimed concentration 5 out of 6 times, and the inconsistency does, in fact, pose a risk to the patient. So are these compounding pharmacies regulated? Well, you probably remember a few years ago when the New England Compounding Center delivered contaminated epidural steroids from which 800 people were sickened, and there were 64 deaths. The executive of NECC was indicted. He received a 9-year prison sentence and a $7.5 million fine for racketeering and fraud conviction. He got off on the murder charges. So where are we going? Well, I'll talk a little bit about the passage of the Drug Quality and Security Act. This was in direct response by the FDA and Congress to these problems with compounders. They created a Section 503B, and I'll talk at some length about this, which is a new breed of compounding drug manufacturer called Outsourcing Facilities. Many of these following slides were taken from Jeffrey Gibbs, who is an attorney who has for a very long time represented compounding pharmacies. So this fellow doesn't have an axe to grind against compounders. Most compounders, if you talk to them, want regulations so that the industry is as fair as it possibly can be. So what happened as a result? Congress passed the Drug Quality and Security Act in 2013, creating this Registered Outsourcing Facilities, or 503B. They also reinvigorated the 503A compounders, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those two. They dramatically increased the FDA inspections for compounding pharmacies, starting in the spring of 2013. They hold pharmacies to very strict compounding standards for aseptic, sterile compounding, and they are deemed producers of sterile products. They've inspected close to 500 compounding pharmacies, and they've issued thousands of FDA inspection observations at hundreds of compounding facilities. Currently, they have issued warning letters to over 100 503A compounders and 60 503B facilities. Now, a warning letter from the FDA basically documents irregularities during its inspection and investigation. And they issue them for violations of regulatory significance, for example, those that actually may lead to an enforcement action if those violations are not promptly and adequately corrected. And as you can imagine, this achieves prompt voluntary compliance with the FDA'S. These are some of the most common observations for those 503A compounding pharmacies. Aseptic processing, deficiencies for monitoring environmental conditions, deficiencies for cleaning and disinfecting the room, procedures designed to prevent microbial contamination were not established, written, and followed. And for the 503B outsourcing facilities, very similar observations. You can read those. In fact, the testing, release of drug product for distribution do not include appropriate laboratory determination of satisfactory conformance to the final specifications and identity and strength of each active ingredient. Therefore, what you get sometimes is simply not what's on the label. You can't count on the concentration or the lack of contaminants. These are some important safety considerations for compounders, the 503As. If you are going to use a compounding pharmacy, there are several things that you need to ask for and keep records of. Unredacted copies of their FDA observations, if there were any, and any warning letters. Ask about recalls, state actions, state licenses, board actions, and FDA state referrals, because you really have to consider the possible patient impact. So these compounding and outsourcing, the two types, as I said, the traditional compounding pharmacy is a 503A. They are regulated under state pharmacy laws. They're held to a very high standard, and the federal law requires that the compounding is pursuant to a prescription or order for an individually identified patient. So these compounding pharmacies cannot produce office-use compounding drugs. That is, you can't produce a vial of Sclerosant and sell that to an individual. These compounders produce legally compounded drugs are exempt from some of the FDA new drug rules, directions for use, and that sort of thing. Now, these are the outsourcing facilities, or the 503B. They're voluntarily registered with the FDA at this point in time, and they may compound for office use. They have to be able to compound sterile products. They do have very strict labeling requirements, and they're exempt from those except for the FDA good manufacturing policies. So let's talk a little bit about that prescription requirement. So for a compounding pharmacy, they must compound a drug for an individually identified patient. They can't produce it in bulk, and they must receive a prescription for a specific patient prior to dispensing the compound. There's something called essentially a copy. So a prescriber needs to make a statement of significant difference. And what that means is the ingredients that are used can't be the same or easily substitutable. For example, if they're within 10% of a commercial product. Here's a good example, 2 25 milligram manufactured doses instead of 1 50 milligram. That's easily substitutable. The statement of significant difference means that there's a significant benefit that the prescriber identifies must be produced by the change. So if you use a compounded drug, you need to be able to state that there's a significant clinical difference made by changing to the compounded drug from the manufactured drug. And back to that, essentially a copy in regularly or inordinate amounts. So they may compound essentially copies of commercial available drugs so long as it's not regularly or in inordinate amounts. And what that means basically is if it's compounded more frequently, that is needed to address unanticipated emergency circumstances. So this is a pretty restrictive. Furthermore, with regularly or in inordinate amounts, other factors that the FDA will consider are copies of more than a small number of prescriptions, routinely substituting compounds that are essentially copies, pre-printed prescription pads without a significant difference determination, and not produced on an as-needed basis. This means that if they produce more than 4 prescriptions per month, they may be in violation. Now, for the 503B outsourcing facilities, these are more strict than for the compounding 503As. They cannot compound an identical or nearly identical drugs. And by that they mean the same active ingredient, route of administration, dosage form, dosage strength, and excipients, or the vehicles, inert vehicles. Also, if the compounded drug contains a bulk drug substance that is a component of an approved drug, they can't compound it. And the prescriber should identify for those patients in whom the change from manufactured drug to compounded drug makes a difference, a clinical difference for the patient. So this is Ken McKenna. He presented a very interesting talk at the ACP Congress in Tucson, and then this magazine article. He is a litigator. He is a plaintiff's attorney in malpractice cases. That's the face of the enemy, in other words. So what he told us was that there are 8 key questions that if he's on the plaintiff's side of a case in which you are involved, he's going to have several questions that he's going to ask you specifically, and you better be able to answer these in order to prevail in a court case. First one, why did you utilize a non-FDA approved product when one was available? Where and when was the agent compounded? Specifics. He wants the specifics, dates, and exact locations. What steps did you take personally to ensure that the compounded agent you used was manufactured in an FDA-registered facility? Do you purchase the agent in bulk, and if so, how is it stored, and what steps do you take to ensure dosage consistency? How did you test the compounded agent to ensure that it was safe, and did you test each batch you received? Have you ever visited that compounding pharmacy? Where does the compounding pharmacy acquire its raw materials, and are they pharmaceutical grade or are they industrial grade? And finally, did you use compounded agents to increase profit? The reason that's important is if you are successfully sued in a malpractice case for using a compounded drug, and it can be shown that you used the drug for monetary gain, damages triple. So, if a physician chooses to use a compounded drug, and a connection can be made between the injury and the drug, the physician is liable, period. Furthermore, an informed consent must be obtained for every patient. They need to know that you are using a compounded drug and that there is a commercial product available. You need to describe the benefits of the compounded drug versus the commercial product and discuss the cost difference. For visual sclerotherapy cosmetically, you can have the patient pay for the extra if they want to use a commercial product, but they have to know all of these things. Now, I'm going to present a couple of cases, one of which I was involved in, the other Dr. Munavali was involved in. This is the case I was involved in as a medical expert. This is a 75-year-old lady who presented in May of 2013 with varicose veins. You can see she'd had a history of breast cancer in the past, some phlebitis in the past, and takes Venustat on a daily basis. She underwent bilateral great saphenous vein thermal ablation and ambulatory phlebectomy someplace else 2 years earlier. Both small saphenous veins were normal at that time. She had all the typical symptoms of venous insufficiency except restless leg, and her BMI was almost 23. These are her images beforehand. You can see there are some varicosities, particularly in the ankle and foot. So a new duplex scan, this is 2 years after the apparent bilateral great saphenous vein ablations, showed a left great saphenous that was absent, but the right great saphenous was present with greater than 3 seconds of reflux. So in May of 2013, on the 22nd, she had a right great saphenous vein laser ablation and had bilateral sclerotherapy using 0.6% compounded SDS foamed in a 4-to-1 ratio. A week later, she presented to the clinic with bilateral foot and ankle ulcers. These were debrided, duoderm was applied, and she was placed on antibiotics and sent to a wound center. These are images. 1 week, you can see some ulcerations in both sides. 2 weeks later, there's some more inflammation. 7 weeks later, they are finally clean, no inflammation, and beginning to close in. So these are slow-healing ulcerations. And that's the patient at discharge from the wound clinic. All of the wounds are closed except for that one that you can see, and that's 10 weeks after the injections. The primary care obtained a neurology consult because of persistent pain the patient had. She was diagnosed as peripheral neuropathy, treated with gabapentin with a good response. This physician was sued for malpractice. The defense attorney contacted me. The physician was unaware that his sclerosant was non-FDA approved. As a matter of fact, he had been told by the compounding pharmacy that the STS he was receiving was, quotes, FDA approved, unquotes. I personally called that same compounding pharmacy and was told exactly the same thing. So, because of the use of compounded sclerosants, I regretfully had to decline in his defense. The defense attorney told me that he was going to go ahead with the case, hoping that the plaintiff's team didn't know about the compounding sclerosant and wouldn't bring it up. Kind of a risky strategy, if you ask me. This is Dr. Munavali's case. He was asked 4 to 5 years ago to serve as the defense witness. Again, he was contacted by the defense team. The case involved cosmetic treatment in the medial malleolar area, treated by an IR in Florida. Compounded POLIDOCANOL was used. Patient outcome was extravasation or injection of an unseen AVM, deep painful ulcerations, and subsequent osteomyelitis due to infection during the healing process. Patient underwent wide debridement and long-term medical intervention because of the osteomyelitis, resulting in a permanent disability. And from Dr. Munavali's perspective, the physician appeared to use proper technique and delivered cosmetic treatment within the standard of care. However, it was impossible for him to circumvent the decision to use compounded POLIDOCANOL. And in retrospect, this physician also thought he was using an FDA-approved product. Now, the elephant in the room is cost. This is a slide comparing costs. And I looked at POLIDOCANOL, both of the FDA-approved POLIDOCANOL, Sclera, and the compounded POLIDOCANOL. You can see the Sclera is $11 per cc for the 1%. If you use 1% compounded from a 2% solution and it's diluted down, it's about $3 per cc. If it's diluted from 5%, it's about $1.80 per cc. I was absolutely unable to identify anybody who could tell me what compounded STS cost. If anybody in the audience knows, I would very much appreciate that information. But FDA-approved sotradecol through Mylan, if you use a 0.5%, which is roughly equivalent to 1% POLIDOCANOL, and it's diluted from 1% STS, it's about $4.50 per cc. So, if you're going to do foam sclerotherapy on patients, and you're going to max out at 10 ml per the guidelines, compounded 1% poly will cost about $5. A Sclera will cost about $30 for a maximum of 10 ml of foam. And 0.5% sotradecol will cost about $11.50 for the 10 mLs. So for cosmetic sclerotherapy, you can let your charges reflect your cost, but for foam sclerotherapy, there is a cost difference, no question about that. But my question would be, what is peace of mind worth? So my suggestions for office procedures are use of only FDA-approved POLIDOCANOL and STS. Stock solutions can be diluted. That's perfectly appropriate to do, to use appropriate concentrations for treating at various different sizes of veins. We have a recipe book that documents how the solutions are diluted, and each of these solutions are dated and used within 1 week of production. So in conclusion, the use of compounded sclerosants may place the patient at risk of injury, as we saw, and may also represent a significant medical legal burden for the provider. Currently, the only FDA-approved sclerosants are the brands of Sclera and sotradecol. And let me emphasize this, no matter what you may be told by the compounding pharmacy, it is simply not possible to obtain an FDA-approved sclerosant from any compounded pharmacy. Thank you very much for your attention. That's a beautiful place in Arizona called Sedona. If you ever get a chance to visit there, you should absolutely do it. Thank you very much, and I will turn it back to Kelly, I believe, or Marge for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. At this time, we will begin the Q&A session. From IAC Vein Center, I'd like to introduce Marge Hutchison, IAC Director of Accreditation, who will assist with questions today. Marge, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Dr. Morrison, for that very excellent presentation. So let me just start off by reiterating that Dr. Morrison said, and I can reiterate that you can only achieve IAC Vein Center accreditation if you do not use compounded sclerosants. They are not permitted in Vein Center accreditation, and obviously the presentation gave us a lot of reasons why. So one of the questions, Dr. Morrison, is, so technically, they cannot do a compounded drug if they can otherwise get that same dose by an FDA-approved medication. Is that true?
That's true, and sometimes I've seen that outsourcing facilities or compounders will try to get around it by producing for example, a 0.6% instead of a 0.5 or instead of a 0.1. If the FDA found out about that, they would probably come down on them, but it's a way to get around it. But you cannot produce a drug that is essentially a copy or something very close to what's available commercially.
So those pharmacies that create the 6% and a practitioner would purchase that and then dilute it down to whatever percentage they wanted, that's not a good practice. True?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, you can do it, and people do it, and I understand wanting to save some money. But if you have a patient who develops an adverse event from the use, no matter what the reason, if a non-FDA approved drug was used, non-FDA approved sclerosant was used, you are liable, period. There's just no getting around it.
So one person has asked, so no compounded sclerosants are FDA approved. Is that true?
Absolutely correct.
All right. So FDA approved sclerosants can be diluted with sterile saline or sterile water?
Yes, they can, and that's a very common practice. In other parts of the world, it's frowned upon, but in the U.S., it's absolutely permitted to dilute these. Some of the dermatologists have been diluting things and had some difficulty with the FDA a couple of years ago, but then it was decided that the dilution was absolutely permitted.
Okay. And can nurses do that dilution, PAs, NPs, that sort of thing, or does it have to be performed by a physician?
I don't know that that's ever been adjudicated, but I will tell you in our practice, the nurses do it. They have the recipe book, and you need to have that a written policy. But if you do have that written policy, nurses in the hospitals obviously dilute medication or change medication all the time. So it's a very common practice, and in our practice, nurses do it.
And I assume that it's true that nurses should go through some kind of a training process in order to be able to do that, and some kind of oversight.
Absolutely.
And that, Okay. So then there's a question here that says the cost difference per patient. What is peace of mind worth? Somebody wants you to kind of expand upon that.
It really comes down to your comfort level. If you want to have no worries, for me, if I get an adverse event, I don't want to have some other factors that factor into what happens with that problem. So if you get sued for an adverse event, I'd much rather defend myself on the basis of my own practice and what I do and the techniques that I use if I have an FDA-approved drug. Because if it is discovered that I didn't use an FDA-approved drug, that case is done. Sit down and write a check.
Wow, But that's so serious. And, from my perspective, we see a lot of facilities that use compounded drugs. It's kind of surprising.
Yeah, and I understand the reasons to do it, and there are absolutely valid reasons in some circumstances to use compounded drugs. But in terms of sclerosants, boy, it's very difficult to defend that.
Someone is asking, how long is POLIDOCANOL good after we dilute it to 0.5%?
I don't know that that's been established, and it also depends on whether you refrigerate it or not. We know for sure that it's good for out a week. What you're worried about is contamination, and the chances that that's going to happen are pretty small. POLIDOCANOL seems to be somewhat bacteriostatic, and so the chances that you're going to get a contamination. So we just set it at 1 week, and my suspicion is it would last much longer, but I don't think there's any point in taking chances.
Could you comment on approved FDA-approved STS or POLIDOCANOL dosages, 1% or 0.5% or even lower for spider veins?
Sure. This is a little bit off topic, but if you use, if you're going to inject STS or POLIDOCANOL, you can generally say that STS is about twice as potent as POLIDOCANOL. So 1% POLIDOCANOL is equivalent to 0.5% STS. Now, for small telangiectasias, 0.1% STS or perhaps 0.25% POLIDOCANOL can be used. That can, if you're not getting the results you expect, you can start to increase the dose. But what you want to do is produce the best result from the least amount and concentration of the drug. And let me also point out, pressure is probably the most important factor in ulcerations following sclerotherapy. So if the concentration is too high or if there's too high pressure, you're going to overcome some of those natural shunts, those AV shunts, and get sclerosant over into the arterial system. So pressure and concentration are really key. So starting in the small veins with 0.1% STS or 0.25 POLIDOCANOL, and then increasing as you need to and as the veins get larger from there.
What about glycerin in the category for compounding?
Yes, and in fact, glycerin is not available. The 72% glycerin is not available, so it's compounded by many people, and that's perfectly legitimate. That's one of those instances in which there is not a commercially available product.
So the key is whether it's commercially available or not, and if it is, then compounding is not recommended.
Yes, correct.
So how does one differentiate between FDA-approved STS and a sclera from compounded STS and POLIDOCANOL?
Well, remember, a compounded pharmacy cannot call any POLIDOCANOL that they produce a sclera. That's protected. And they can't call any STS sclerosant that they produce sotradecol. So it's going to has to be called by its generic name or some other name. So you won't be able to obtain Sclera or sotradecol from a compounding pharmacy. Let me restate that. I guess it's possible that they could sell you FDA-approved STS and a Sclera, but that's not the business that they're in.
So that would defeat their purposes.
Yes, correct.
Are there other sclerosants other than STS and POLIDOCANOL that are FDA-approved?
You know, there are, but some of them, for example, hypertonic saline is approved, but never went through a testing process. It was approved long before there were any testing process, so it was kind of grandfathered in. And there are some other sodium moruate that was FDA approved, but it's not used very much at all. Most of the others have really fallen by the wayside, other than the POLIDOCANOL, the sotradecol, and the glycerin.
Someone is asking, what is the rate of complication from compounded sclerosants compared to FDA-approved sclerosants?
And the answer is nobody has looked at that. We have the impression. Here's a story that years ago when POLIDOCANOL was not available, but the pharmacies, compounded pharmacies, could get it for you, and it was POLIDOCANOL, in my estimation, is really a more forgiving drug than is STS, just because of its potency, among other things. POLIDOCANOL wasn't available, and so we used we had a compounder from Las Vegas who produced POLIDOCANOL for us. We had a spate of ulcerations. We couldn't figure out what was going on until the nurses told me that they had started using this compounded drug, and so we stopped using it. So it's anecdotal evidence only, but we've seen it in our practice where there clearly is a difference.
So this is interesting because these people say that their compounding pharmacy tells them that they are FDA-approved pharmacy.
And I've heard exactly the same thing. So the pharmacy can be FDA registered. That's true. And the products that they use, so the raw products that they use, the ingredients can be FDA approved, but the FDA approves solutions. And it's the sclerosing solutions that we use on patients. And it's not possible for you to get an FDA approved sclerosing solution from a compounder or an outsourcing facility. So what's happened just over the last year or two is that the compounders, because they can't produce in bulk, they have these outsourcing facilities that are 503Bs, and they're the ones who produce the sclerosing agents in bulk. That's been a fundamental change that just wasn't there a couple of years ago.
I guess basically the point is don't use compounded sclerosants.
Well, that's certainly my recommendation. I understand that there are significant reasons to want to use compounded drugs. So the chief among them is the cost. But I sure feel more comfortable defending myself in the case of an adverse event if I haven't used a non-FDA approved sclerosant.
Yeah, I've spoken to physicians who use compounded agents, and of course, you know, that's a hot topic in our world. And many times they say, hey, we've done 10,000, 20,000 cases, whatever, and we've never had a problem. And, you know, it's hard to have something to say back to them.
Yeah, and I think overall the compounded drugs, sclerosants that they're using are probably going to be just fine. But it's that instance, and I do a fair bit of medical malpractice work helping defend physicians, and I see on my own desk, I see probably 4 or 5 cases per year of adverse events from sclerosants. It happens and they're not defensible.
Yeah, so you may have 30,000 good cases, but that one could do you in for sure.
Yep, and you know, think of it from the patient's perspective. The likelihood is that they're going to do just fine. But boy, you develop a painful ulceration, and like that lady had the osteomyelitis, that's a disaster for that patient. And boy, you just created a real problem for that patient.
Yeah. Just a few questions that are a little bit off topic. Some are asking about, are you willing to share your recipes for a sclera and STS?
You mean for dilutions? Is that what they're asking?
Yes. Sure.
If anybody wants to contact me on that last slide, there's my email address, and I'll be happy to send our dilution table.
Okay. Another question off topic a little bit. Is there any role for hypertonic saline as a sclerosant agent?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been around a long time, and some people are very comfortable using it. When we first started our practice, we did use hypertonic saline, and when some of the other manufactured products became available, it was clear to us that the safety profile for these newer drugs was better than for hypertonic saline. For example, the rate of ulcerations and matting seemed to be significantly less with the newer agents than with the hypertonic saline. But that hasn't been well studied. In the few studies that are available, that opinion is backed up, but it's not hard evidence, I wouldn't say.
All right, and then let's close with your comments regarding foaming, which is not really addressed by the IAC, but certainly it's a common practice. What are your thoughts about foaming?
Okay, so foaming's been around now for almost 20 years. It has clearly become the standard of care for taking care of veins larger than telangiectasias or reticular veins. And it's even used by really experts on those veins. So there's no question that foam has become the standard of care. If you have an adverse event from a patient, when you use foam sclerotherapy, you have exposure, medical legal exposure, first from a lawsuit and secondly from the feds. So theoretically, it's never been adjudicated by the FDA that foam, a foamed sclerosant, is or is not the same drug as the liquid. Most would say that it's probably not the same drug and probably has different biologic effects, but it's never been adjudicated by the FDA. And consequently, the FDA has told us it's almost never going to happen that the FDA is going to come into your practice and give you a bad time for using foam sclerotherapy. So now that leaves the medical legal exposure that you have in a lawsuit. I have testified more than once that foam sclerotherapy is the standard of care. So the key is, in a malpractice action, did the physician fall below the standard of care? And if they used foam, it is clearly above the standard of care.
All right. Well, thank you for that. That's basically all the questions we have that are on topic. There's a few off topic that we will address via email. So we'll let Kelly come in and finish up. And thank you, Dr. Morrison, for all your time and everything you've put into this presentation. It's greatly appreciated.
Sure. You're welcome, Marge.
Thanks again, everyone, and a very special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Morrison. Please feel free to contact IAC with any questions that were not answered during the Q&A session. To receive continuing education credit for attending this webinar, please complete the survey. The survey will appear on your screen automatically at the conclusion of this live session and also be available from the IAC webinars portal for 3 business days. On the left side of the My Account page, you'll click on Webinars. Look for the title of this session, Compounded Sclerosants, What I Need to Know for a Responsible Decision. Beneath this title, you will see the button Attend Event. Click this button, then the Evaluation tab, then click Take Evaluation to complete the survey. Your certificate can then be accessed and printed from the very next screen and any time thereafter through the CE Transcript section on the My Account page. If you have any questions about the survey, please contact us at webinars@intersocietal.org. Once again, we thank you for joining us today and appreciate your participation.